Well, I mean, I guess we could just jump right in, and like, I guess we're talking about nature. So, what is nature? I mean, we everyone kind of knows what nature is. There's an innate part of us. It's like, yeah, that's nature, or that's not nature. But how would you actually define nature?
I mean, that's a really difficult question to answer, I think, because a lot of people define nature differently, of course. Like I think in the Western conception, there's this idea that nature is kind of whatever isn't human or whatever isn't, mankind. So like we have our cities and our culture and our society, and then kind of everything else is kind of nature. But I mean, other societies live a lot closer to nature, or they think of themselves as part of nature. Like the indigenous cultures around the world certainly think of themselves as more connected to the processes of the earth, and they don't really see like a disconnect between it. So it's really difficult to define exactly what we mean by it. But I mean, as long as you define it, I think it's okay. But how do you think about it typically?
I mean, if you asked me this question yesterday and I was just like sitting on my couch, I probably would have said something like, just basically anything that's natural, that's non-human, just some really simple definition like that. But it's just interesting that you mentioned that there's this disconnect with Western culture, and that sort of assumes that we are not natural or that we've done something to detach ourselves from nature to the point where we are no longer natural, and the environments that we live in are no longer natural. I think it's obvious to everyone that something like a city, you go to New York City, there's not a whole lot of
Hmm.
nature around you. But I mean, what is the reason for this sort of like detachment from ourselves and nature and Western culture that's not happening in, say, Aboriginal culture?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, at least from my understanding and readings into this, I think the fact that humans are less, or sorry, West like modern societies rather, are less limited by natural constraints. So like we have food production, so we have agriculture, and we have energy production, and we're not sort of connected directly to the ebbs and flows of the world around us. So in that sense, we're kind of like making our own rules, and we're kind of disconnected from like the outside system, at least to the average person's point of view. But I think if you actually look at everything, you'd realize that we're still, even agriculture obviously is still very heavily dependent on nature or ecosystem processes and the world around us. So I would say it's kind of like a myth that we're disconnected from nature, but I can understand why people would kind of perceive that, just because we seem to have less constraints than say your average indigenous tribe or something like that.
Yeah, it sort of goes back to that trope of humans playing God, right? It's sort of like you cast off your natural environment. You basically like become the top predator. You basically learn how to harness the entire environment for your own good. And then you basically kill off the legend of the actual God and religion. And then you are basically the gods of the earth, for better or for worse.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a pretty scary thing in a way, because we don't really know what we're doing. We kind of opened up Pandora's box. Like if you look at the world and you see our massive population growth, we're in every corner of this planet. I mean, if we weren't humans, you would say we were kind of like a disease or something. Like we've just covered everywhere in the whole world. We don't really know where things will take us going forward. So like the modern world is definitely, everybody seems to think that everything is pretty secure in our in what we're doing right now, but we have no idea what the future will hold, because this is something completely new, like on like a
Mm-hmm.
geological scale. Like we've never had societies this large and that utilize this many resources. We've been hunter gatherers for most of our history as a species, much more connected to quote unquote nature. So I mean, yeah, like I think there's a lot of risk with kind of where we're at right now as a society.
Yeah, I think so. It's like we kind of like nature on our own terms. Like people like might want to go to the park and just sit in the park for a while, or people might want to like basically go visit a farm. But God, if you work on a farm, there's a massive stigma there. You're a country bumpkin that isn't civilized and educated. So we've even separated ourselves from nature in terms of our own occupations. in terms of our education to some extent, and sort of just the way that we perceive a modernized, civilized human being.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think there's kind of like a resistance to feel like you're actually in nature, and I think for many years or many centuries even, Western society really saw themselves as above nature or controlling nature, or that was like the intent of what we should be doing, not really being in nature. Because I think the perception, at least in Western culture, is that if you're in nature, then you're kind of like almost like a savage. You're not, you don't have control over your world around you, and you're not civilized, or something like that. So I think there's a long history in Western culture of this sense of disconnect between what's natural and what's unnatural.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, think about something like the Industrial Revolution. That's literally like 200 years ago. No, it's barely a glimpse in time. And I mean, you already have like this massive backlash against it. As soon as it happens, you have all these like romantic poets pining for the old days, and there's still a lot of people that are basically like, "What happened? Why are we all living in these like crazy big cities, looking at computers all day?" And why, how is this the better life? I think a lot of people objectively live better. Like we have longer lifespans, we have better medicine, we generally we get better education, we have access to more resources. But there's definitely something that we lost in this transformation, and I think a lot of that comes down to our mental health and our sort of like our natural alignment with our planet.